האם זה באמת סגולה בדוקה? הסגולה ללמוד בזה?
Erev Tov, good evening, Dobro V'Yetcher. We are in the Zera Shimshon on the Haggadah Shel Pesach. We're going to do Drush Hay, section number 5. And the Zera Shimshon starts right with a very well-known quote from the Haggadah. V'hi she'amda lavosenu v'lanu, and it is the thing that has stood for our forefathers and for us. We'll talk about the it in a moment. Shelo echad bilvad amad aleinu, because not only has one enemy stood against us, elisha b'chol dor vador, but rather in every generation, omdim aleinu lechalosenu, they rise up against us to destroy us. V'hakodesh baruch hu matzilenu miyodam, and the Holy One, blessed be He, saves us from their hand. So what is the it that has stood for us? And it's the promise that Hashem made at the bris bein habesarim, as the Zera Shimshon is about to explain. At the covenant of the parts, Hashem made a promise to Avraham that Hashem would redeem us and rescue us from the nation that would be oppressing us, and that promise has saved us, and it saved us not only from Mitzrayim but also from all future nations that sought to destroy us. Let's continue in the Zera Shimshon. Hiksha hazevach Pesach. The commentary written by the famous, the great Abarbanel, called the Zevach Pesach. In that commentary, a question is raised. Sha'af sheha emes hu, sha'avosenu b'mitzrayim nitzolu. Even though it is true, of course, that our forefathers in Mitzrayim, all the way back in Mitzrayim, were saved bishvil hayud shall havtachas bein habesarim, because of the promise that was made to Avraham at the covenant of the parts, which we just mentioned. De ka'amar le'el, as it states earlier in the Haggadah, Baruch shomer havtachaso Yisrael. Hashem is blessed because He kept His promise that He made to the Jewish people, v'chule, etc. So even though that's true, Eich ka'amar hacha, how can it say here in the Haggadah, the osa havtacha amda lavosenu vilanu, that same promise has stood for our forefathers and for us? The Eich Yitzur shebishvil havtachas bein abesarim, because how is it possible that the promise that was made all the way back thousands of years ago to Avram Avinu, Asher kvar niskaima b'yitzias Mitzrayim, that promise was already fulfilled when Hashem rescued us from Mitzrayim? Anachnu nitzolim hayom hazeh. How can we still be saved and protected by that promise? So the Abarbanel's question is a very fundamental and important question. He asks, the Haggadah states, again famously, V'hi she'amda, this promise that Hashem made to Avram Avinu has protected us not just back in Mitzrayim, but through all future times when evil nations tried to destroy us. So he says, how does that fit with the events that took place? It appeared that Hashem came to Avraham and said to him, your descendants will be in a foreign land and they'll be oppressed, and I'm going to save you. So that happened. Hashem saved us from Mitzrayim. That's what we celebrate during the holiday of Pesach. That's what we're about to celebrate, Yetzias Mitzrayim. But how do we assume that the Abarbanel asks, how do we assume that promise still has applied through all of the years since then and until today? We still read the same line in the Haggadah now every year. So that's the question. Next paragraph. Uledidan lo kasha klal. Zera Shimshon says, according to our way of thinking, this is not a problem. Shaharei b'mamad bein habesarim, because at the event of the bris bein habesarim, herilo hakodesh baruch hu la'Avraham, Hashem showed Avraham Kol ha'arba malchios, all four of the future powers, that powerful dominating world powers that were going to oppress the Jewish people. Kemosha Amru b'Medrash, as it states in the Medrash, V'hine ema chashecha. This is taking the Medrash in Bereshis Rabbah, takes the pasuk, a pasuk from the Bris Bein HaBasarim, where Hashem is speaking to Avraham, and it breaks apart the pasuk, and it says, when it says ema, fear, ema zo bavel. Ema was a reference to Avram Avinu. Hashem told Avram Avinu, the Babylonians in the future will oppress the Jewish people. It's not just going to be the Mitzrim, the Egyptians, and after that it'll be four other great powers. One will be Bavel. Then it said the word chashecha, darkness, zomadai. That referred to the Median and Persian Parasumadai empire. And then it said Gedola, great. That referred to Yavan. And then it referred to the Roman Empire as well. V'im kain, and if so, bevadai sheba'osa havtacha shehivtiach la'Avram. If Hashem already at the time of the Bris Bein HaBasarim was communicating to Abraham and showing him and telling him about the future exiles that the Jewish people will suffer and the future great nations that would oppress the Jewish people. So certainly at the same time when he made a promise to Abraham to save the Jews, lahatzilenu, to save us, shaycha l'chol hageulos, that promise applies and is relevant to all of the future redemptions. So the Zera Shimshon says that the Abarbanel's question can be answered based on this Medrash Rabbah, which tells us that at the Bris Bein HaBasarim, Hashem already told Avraham about the future suffering and oppression and exiles that the Jewish people would suffer, and therefore, when Hashem made a promise to Avraham to rescue the Jewish people, it did not only apply; it wasn't limited to Mitzrayim. It also applied to these future oppressions and exiles that Hashem told Avraham about. Next paragraph. Omnam, however, b'derech acher, in a different way, novo l'dayek divrei hamagid, we can analyze the words of the Haggadah, shelo echad bilvad omad aleinu, not only did one rise up against us, top of the next column on the left, ela shebachol dor vador, and every generation, omdim aleinu, they rise up against us. V'koshe, there's another question to ask. Dema betza imiya echad omed aleinu or rabim? What benefit is it to the Jewish people whether there's one oppressor or many oppressors? Meaning that the Haggadah, the language of the Haggadah, the phrasing of the Haggadah seems to imply that Hashem was showing compassion to us when he made it that there wasn't just one oppressor, but there would be many. Shelo echad bilvad, it won't just be one, but it will be many. And it seems to indicate that it's better for us that there are many oppressors rather than one. So the Zera Shimshon says, Zera Shimshon asks, why is that true? Why is it better for there to be many rather than one? The Adarabah, just the opposite. Nira, it would appear, sheyoser tov hoyolonu, it's better for us, im yiyeh echad levad, if there would only be one oppressor, velo sheyeh rabim, and not that there should be many. If we had our druthers, as the saying goes, if we had our choice, wouldn't we say, let's just have one nation that oppresses us over and over again? For example, let's take the Mitzrim. Let's just have the Mitzrim oppress us. Why is it better that there should be many oppressors over the time and that it should change from one nation to another nation? Or even if you want to say at any given time in history, let it just be one nation. Why is it better for there to be multiple nations oppressing the Jews? The intention of the author of the Haggadah apparently is to say, Shebishvil havtachoso lo rotza, According to Hashem's promise, he did not want that there should be one nation rising up against us. Apparently, that's not what Hashem wanted. Elarabim, but many nations. So for some reason, Hashem, part of Hashem's plan is that instead of one nation rising up and oppressing the Jews, it should be spread across many nations. Ve'od, and more so, shehayu lo l'sayim devorov ela sherabim omdim aleinu. The Zera Shimshon says another question is that the Haggadah should have said not only one, but many. V'amai siyim shebechol dor vador. Why did the Haggadah change the language? Why did it vary the metaphor, so to speak, and say in every generation they rise up? It's instead of saying in not only one nation, but many nations rise up, the Haggadah says not only one nation, but in every generation. So why did it do that? Dema inyan bechol dor vador hacha. Because what is the relevance of saying in every generation? What's the importance, the significance of saying in every generation they rise up against us? So the Zera Shimshon started with the question from the Abarbanel's commentary on the Haggadah. He dealt with that question rather handily by bringing in the Medrash Rabbah. And then he says, but I do have two other questions. I have two new questions on the Vihi She'amda, and those he just gave us. Why is it better for there to be many oppressors, many oppressive nations that oppress the Jewish people rather than just one? Why does that seem to be better? Why is that Hashem's plan? And two, why does the language say instead of one, there it will happen in every generation, as opposed to instead of one, there will be many? So let's continue the next paragraph. Omnam, however, kfar hochachnu b'sedorim uvadrushim hakodmim. We already have demonstrated in previous parshios and previous droshos she'im hoyu Yisrael misakvim b'Mitzrayim, that if Bnei Yisrael had been held up in Mitzrayim ad tashlum ha'arba meos shana, until the predicted 400 years would have been complete, lo hoyu mishtavdim od b'golios acheros, they would not have been subjected to other future exiles. So if the exile in Mitzrayim had actually lasted for 400 years, then that would have ended the experience of exile that was planned for the Jewish people. That would have been it. Ulefi sheyotzu kodem zmanum, because Bnei Yisrael went out from Mitzrayim before the completion of their time, the 400 years. They were compelled to have future exile, periods of exile. And Hashem redeemed Bnei Yisrael from Mitzrayim in a hurry, because they had already entered the 49th gate of impurity. V'im hoyu nichnosim b'shar hachamishim, and if they had gone one step lower to the 50th level of impurity, lo hoya chas v'sholem od lahem tekuma, then God forbid there would not have been a way for them to rise up again, for them to escape. They would have been stuck in Mitzrayim, and not only stuck in Mitzrayim, they would have been eternally, God forbid, they would have been eternally stuck in this lowest level of impurity, and they would not have been able to escape physically or spiritually. Next page, paragraph on the right. V'koshe, and it's another problem. She'im machmas tsar hagolus nichnesu b'memte sharei tuma. If we are to understand that it was because of the pain and suffering of the exile in Mitzrayim, the oppression, the servitude in Mitzrayim, that the Jewish people were pressed down into the 49th level of impurity, sof, then in the end, af begolius acherim, then how did it help to have them go to other exiles later after Mitzrayim, after sheyavo lahem kach? Perhaps in those exiles they would suffer and go down to the 50th level of Tumah. Umahoil kiviyochol bisakonoso. And how did Hashem's solution of taking us out of Mitzrayim, how was that effective when by taking us out of Mitzrayim early, it subjected us to future exiles, which could, in those future exiles, perhaps, God forbid, the Jews could descend because of the suffering down to the 50th level of Tumah. In other words, the question is, if Hashem had to hurry and take us out of Mitzrayim because we had reached the 49th level of impurity, and had we hit the 50th, we never could have been rescued. How could Hashem's plan have been? I'll take them out quickly, which will result in them having future exiles. And in the future exiles, we would think, okay, wait a minute, now we can go down, God forbid, and hit the 50th level of Tumah. So what was the plan? What was God's solution? V'im tomar, and if you say, sheshar hagolius lo haya kol kach arukim, that the other exiles were not so long, shahare golus bavel lo haya el shivim shana. For example, the original exile to Bavel was only 70 years, v'chule, etc. And so if you suggest and say that's why Hashem wasn't worried about future exiles, v'halo golus zeh ba'avonosenu harabim hu yoser me elef v'tov kuf shana. Zera Shimshon says the exile that we're in right now, in his time, which is still true of our time, the Zera Shimshon lived in the 18th century, in the 1700s. So the exile had already lasted in his time more than 1,500 years, and we're still in the same exile. So why was Hashem not concerned that we could reach the 50th level of Tumah, God forbid, through the suffering of future exiles, which would exist because Hashem took us out early before the 400 years from Mitzrayim? Next paragraph. V'yesh lomar, we can say, the Amrinon beperek chesed Pesachim, the Gemara says in the 8th chapter of Maseches Pesachim, Tzidkos Pizrono b'Yisrael. The Gemara over there quotes a pasuk from Sefer Shoftim, which says, Hashem did righteous acts with the open cities of Yisrael. So the Gemara says it doesn't just mean, that pasuk doesn't just refer to the actions of Hashem vis-a-vis the open cities in Eretz Yisrael at that time in Sefer Shoftim, but it hints to us, it alludes to us something about the future. Tzedakah asa HaKadosh Baruch Hu im Yisrael. Hashem shows mercy to the Jewish people, shepizron lebein ha'umos, when he disperses them amongst the nations of the world. There's a play on the word pizrono, which in the pasuk itself refers to open cities, and the Gemara's use of saying shepizron, Hashem disperses b'nei Yisrael amongst the nations, and that is a tzedakah. That's an act of charity to the Jewish people. Lo yadi hechi lemevan. By dispersing the Jewish people to many nations, they don't know what to do. Because if a nation wants to destroy all the Jews, God forbid, not all the Jews are in that nation. Since Hashem has dispersed the Jews, when Hashem has exiled the Jews, he disperses them to several nations. So if one nation decides they want, God forbid, to completely eliminate, to wipe out the Jewish people, chas v'shalom, they can't do it because they don't have control over all the Jews. Not all of the Jews are in their nation. Lich lumai de'ika gabayhu. So the nation might say, I'm going to destroy all the Jews that are in fact in my nation. Karule malchusa kitiyasa. So then the other nations where Jews live will call that nation a genocidal nation, a murderous nation. So by having the Jews in different nations, it works to the Jewish people's benefit. Uvehosaliku, and these guys get started. Uvehonachasu, and these guys are resting, meaning that by having the Jewish people spread out in different nations, it is a way of securing the Jewish people's future in continuity, because no single nation has the power over all the Jews. And when one nation, if they want to hurt the Jews, and the other nations, they're being relatively kind to the Jews. So that's why it was part of Hashem's plan to disperse the Jews to many nations. And that's why it was considered an act of tzedakah on Hashem's part to do that. Of course, that question relates back to the that point relates back to the Zera Shimshon's question, one of his earlier questions on why the Baal Haggadah says that it's not just one nation that rises against us, but Hashem's plan seems to be that many nations will rise against us. So Hashem, the Zera Shimshon just explained, spread the Jews out to many different nations, which it's true means that over time, more than one nation, several nations will oppress the Jews, God forbid, but it's to the Jewish people's benefit for their continuity to be spread out amongst several nations and many nations, as opposed to all being located in one place. Next paragraph. Ve'im kain, if so, shapir ka'amar hamagid. It's correct what the Haggadah says, shelo echad bilvad oman aleinu lechalosenu, that it wasn't just one who rose against us to destroy us. She'im haya omed aleinu echad bilvad, because if only one nation could rise against us to destroy us, meaning if all of the Jews were situated and located in one nation, hayinu bisakona gedola, we would be in great danger. Because then there would be, God forbid, the power of one nation to destroy the Jewish people. They would all be located in one place. Omnam, however, ato shehim rabim, now that the Jews are spread out in many nations, einam yecholim lamod aleinu. They are not able to all rise against us simultaneously, God forbid, to destroy us. V'zehu hisha omdal avosenu vilonu. And this is part of what it means when it says this promise has stood for us and our forefathers. Since in the other exiles, the Jewish people were spread out, all of them could not sink down, meaning to the 50th level of Tumah, which was not the case with the exile in Mitzrayim. In Mitzrayim, all of the Jews were in one place. They were all in Mitzrayim. So as they sank down level by level by level into spiritual malaise, into deeper and deeper into the abyss of impurity, all of that included the whole Jewish people. But after that, in the future exiles, Hashem made sure that they were spread out and that they were not all in one place. Top of the next column. Shahayu kulam b'kibbutz echad. In Mitzrayim, they were all in one place. Ubegolos Bavel, and in Golos Bavel, even though it's true, all of the Jews basically were in Bavel at that time. Lo yoshvu ki im shivim shana, as the Zera Shimshon already pointed out, that was an exile of only 70 years. So the danger of them sinking down to the 50th level of Tumah, God forbid, wasn't a concern, because Hashem knew they would be there a relatively short time. Next paragraph. In order to answer the question that the Zera Shimshon had posed previously, why did the Haggadah say in every generation, v'lo b'chol umma v'umma, and it didn't say in every nation and nation? Mipnei, it's because shalif amim yesh umma yoser kosher mechaverta. Sometimes a certain nation is more difficult, more cruel, more more cruel than another nation. Kid the Amrinan, as the Gemara in Gittin states, O betulach, O betula de bar Esav. Over there, the request is made, so to speak, to Hashem. Either we should be in your protection, meaning in Eretz Yisrael, or under the shade of Esav, but we shouldn't be under the power and control of Bavel. So the Gemara there makes the statement that from one perspective, being under the control of Esav and the descendants of Esav, it was the Roman Empire, would have been better for the Jews than being under the control of Bavel. But then the Gemara brings a contradictory quote that the Zera Shimshon assumes we know, it's not quoted here, in which it seems to imply that Bavel was better for the Jews than Rome. So how does that work? Is it Rome or Bavel? Which one is more cruel? Which one is more temperate? So the Gemara answers, one statement was made before the Persians came to Bavel. One statement was made after the Persians came to Bavel. What that means is that when the Persians took over the Babylonian Empire, it became a crueler, more merciless, more ruthless empire. But before the Persians took over the Babylonian Empire, it wasn't as bad. It wasn't as evil. And so that's why in one place the Gemara says that being in Rome, under Roman control, would have been better for the Jews than being under Babylonian control, because it's referring to when the Babylonians were taken over by the Persians, and it was more cruel. And the other place it says that being in Babylonian control would be better than Roman control. That's before the Persians took over Rome, and the Babylonian control was not so terrible. Ve'eno nikar she'osim zeh b'sinosam osanu. It's not easily apparent to know if a nation oppresses the Jews because they hate them, they hate us, or perhaps it's because of their innate cruelty. Very interesting point. It's hard to know when a nation demonstrates cruelty and anti-Semitism if it's really because they hate the Jews, that's the cause, or perhaps it's because they're a very cruel nation, very cruel people, and they like hurting people. The Od Amrinon, and we also say, Re'eh she'ein Yisrael yechol ro'ah. Hashem saw she'ein Yisrael yecholim lekabel gezeras romim. Hashem saw that the Jewish people could not have made it under the control of the Romans. Amad v'higlo sam leBavel, and so he stood and exiled them to Bavel. That's actually the statement that was not quoted previously, implying that being under the Babylonian rule would be easier for the Jews than being under Roman rule. So there are two contradictory statements about which was worse, Bavel or Rome. This paragraph and this whole paragraph, the Zera Shimshon is making the point that it's almost impossible to know in any given time period which nation is better or worse, which nation will be crueler, which nation will be more oppressive, which nation will be less oppressive, and also why it is at any given time that a particular nation is so terrible. Is it because of innate cruelty, or is it because of hatred of the Jews for some reason? So it's complicated to know. It's complicated to know where it's better to be. So therefore, Hashem spread us out to many different nations. Next paragraph. Umishum hachi naka dafka b'chol dor vador. And there's another reason why it specifically says in every generation. L'shelafi masa hador, because it's based on the actions of a particular generation, meaning of Jews. Even a nation that's not normally so cruel, might rise up to destroy us because of the actions of a particular generation of Jews, meaning the actions of the Jewish people during, or at least some of them, during a particular time period that could provoke, that could bring out a response of cruelty, even from a non-Jewish nation that normally would not be so cruel. K'diamrinan, as the Gemara states, Ein puranus bala olam, punishment and suffering doesn't come to the world, ella bishvil Yisrael, unless it is in some way connected to the actions of the Jewish people. Ve'od amrinan peperek tolin, and we also say in Maseches Tolin, in the Maseches Shabbos and Perek Tolin, ibatle yehire, if arrogant Jewish people would disappear, batle amgushe, then the oppression caused by the heretical nations of the world would disappear. Ibadle dayone, if the corrupt Jewish judges would disappear, badle gizir pote, then the cruel law enforcement agencies would disappear. So this is an amazing statement in the Gemara that says that when the Jewish people are suffering from different groups, different oppressors, they should realize that in some way that is connected to groups of Jewish people who are behaving in the wrong way. And if that group of Jews would change their behavior and do tshuva and leave behind, forsake their evil ways and switch to doing the right thing, then the group of oppressors would also disappear and not oppress the Jews. Ubi Yavamus, and in Maseches Yavamus, Gozru al Habasar, the Gemara states that at a certain point in time, the non-Jewish authorities made rules against preparing the meat in a kosher way. They said you can't do shlita. They outlawed shlita. Mipnei hamatanos, and that was because the Jews were not being careful about the gifts of meat that they were supposed to give to the Kohanim. Gozru al hamerchatzaos, and at a certain point they made a decree that the Jews couldn't use the bathhouses, mipnei hatavila, because the Jews were not being careful about the immersion in the mikvah. And at another point, they were digging up the Jewish cemeteries, the graves of the Jews in the Jewish cemetery. And that was because the Jews were celebrating non-Jewish holidays. So each time, each generation, depending on the weaknesses, the flaws, the sins, God forbid, of the Jews in that generation, that's what causes an outbreak of anti-Jewish feeling and anti-Jewish activity in that generation. So that's the meaning of Bechol Dor Vador, in every generation. Ve'af al pichein, and even though there's a connection from the oppression that the Jews suffer to their own actions, to the actions of some Jewish people, even so, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Matzilenu Miyodam, Hashem saves us in every generation. Shelo Yechalu Osanu, that the oppressors of the Jews are never able to destroy us, God forbid, by spreading us out to different nations, by having some nations have feelings of cruelty towards the Jews, while other nations are feeling more tolerant of Jews. All of these things are part of Hashem's plan to make sure that in every generation, even taking into account whatever sins the Jews might be, some Jews might be involved in, God forbid, Hashem has arranged things so that we can never be destroyed. And every time there are oppressors, we need to know that however bad it gets, God forbid, chas v'shalom, Hashem has arranged things so the entire Jewish people will survive. And chen yehi ratzon, that should be God's will, not only that we should survive, but that we should thrive in the time of Mashiach that should come speedily in our days. Thank you for joining in the Zera Shimshon this week. We look forward to learning together again in the Zera Shimshon in the future.